Hey everyone, it's David Bombal coming to you again from Oxford in the United Kingdom. Again on a call with Hank Preston, who's based in the US. Hank, welcome to the call again.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. Always a pleasure.
So Hank, last week we didn't manage to finish talking about how to install DevNet applications or developer applications on a Windows computer. So I'm hoping that you can continue showing us some of the tools that network engineers can use.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things that there's the pieces, and the installation that we went through is important. But I think what was even more important was the dialogue we had last week on why the tools are there, how they fit in, alternatives that pop through. And I think we'll continue that as we kind of go through the setting up your Windows development environment journey today. So.
Yeah, that's great. Looking forward to it. I mean, I believe you're going to show us a bit about Docker, perhaps Postman, Linux subsystem, stuff like that. Is that right?
Yep, that's what we've got on the list, and we're gonna pick up. And just as a reminder, we have put together a learning lab up on DevNet that walks through kind of the basic development toolkit and how to install it on all your platforms, whether you're Windows or Mac or Linux. And we started last week going through that lab kind of one step at a time through Python and the rest. And we're going to continue along with where we left off with looking at some of the really common development tools and clients that'll help you in your journey to explore APIs and build software and code on that. And for that, the first one we're going to start out with is one of my favorite API clients, and that's Postman. You can find it at getpostman.com. And what Postman is it's a REST API kind of development client. It's got tons of uses for lots of different types of developers and people. But what's interesting for us as network engineers or just infrastructure developers in general is that it's a really easy way to craft and explore individual REST APIs for different platforms. And so if you're working with DNA Center, APIC-EM, or Cisco's ACI, and you want to see how the REST API works and test them out, Postman's a great client to build those and see how they work and craft them and experiment with the headers and the different types of methods that are there. What's also really nice about Postman is that it works like a web browser, kind of. It gives you the ability to save what they call collections, and collections are like bookmarks of different API calls. And so what I'll do is I'll build up huge libraries of API calls for the different platforms that I use, and then I can always go back into Postman and really quickly look at them again and go through. It's got some awesome other cool tools that are useful for it that we'll look at as we go into it. And so to start out, I'm at getpostman.com/apps, and it's just the download page for it. And you can see that we can download Postman for Mac, but we're on Windows. And so I've already done the download to save us some time here on the video. And so I'm going to go over here and just run the Postman installer.
Now, I wanted to jump in and say, Hank, sorry to interrupt that.
Oh, no problem.
This is not a Cisco tool. It can be used with GNS3 or many other applications. It basically, as you said, it's an API interface, isn't it? So it can be used with any kind of API. Sorry, go on.
No, that's absolutely true. What's also nice about it is Postman does offer a subscription offering that gives you additional features. But the free community version, frankly, is more than enough for what I do on a daily basis and most network engineers that are there. The full version offers additional features, and you can look at what they are, but they're really built for folks that are actually designing APIs for their own platforms. And so it can help them actually do documentation, run tests to make sure their APIs are working as expected. A whole bunch of advanced features that we generally don't need as folks that are consuming different APIs that are there. But yeah, and you'll notice when we bring this up, we'll use this to make API calls for jokes and cat facts and all sorts of random stuff just to show that it works. So
great.
Mm-hmm. And we can continue to dialogue here as the general installation is going in the background. One of the things that's interesting about this installation is normally when you install any application, it pops up and you have to answer some questions and hit next a few times. Postman, it threw me off the first time. You double click on it and then it takes a second and then it's installed. It doesn't ask any questions. It just kind of works. It's really handy.
And it works with Chrome and other browsers. Is that right? Or is it a separate application?
That's a really good question, because Postman, when it first started several years ago, it was an add-in to Chrome. And so if you remember a few years ago when Chrome first came out, Chrome had this concept you could build Chrome apps, and you would install applications into the Chrome browser, and they were part of the browser. Now, Postman originally was a Chrome app, but then over time, for security and efficiency and gosh knows what other reasons, Google decided to pull out that whole apps concept from Chrome. And then around that same time, maybe a little before, Postman broke out and became an independent application. And so today, the way that you should use it is as an independent app. If you still have a case where you've got the Postman app installed for Google Chrome, I don't even know if it would work with the latest versions of Chrome, but you definitely want to move to the full client application, not just the browser add-in, because today it is a full browser, or it's a full app, and it's available for Mac, Linux, Windows, obviously, because that's where we're installing it here.
I just want to go back to what we said originally. When we had a lot of comments on our last videos about Windows, and I think it's important. You mentioned right in the beginning that we're showing installation here on Windows, but on DevNet there is a whole process you can follow, is that right, for Mac and Linux. It's not as if we're just pushing Windows, we're just showing that option because a lot of network people use Windows.
Exactly. And that's the thing. When I first started in the whole programmability space, and it was several years ago, I think Windows 7 was the current version of Windows that was there. And at that point, the types of development that was there and the tooling that was available, it could be a bit of a challenge to use Windows. They didn't have Docker. Python didn't work exactly the same. Some of these utilities weren't there for Windows. And so at that point, and this was 5-6 years ago, there was a good argument to be said that if you wanted to do development in this space, you probably either needed to go Linux or Mac or run a VM. But over the last several years, that entire idea has changed significantly. Today, with the applications that are available, as well as the changes that Microsoft has made to Windows, you can have a very robust and similar development experience between Windows or Mac or Linux. And one of the things we did when we set out to kind of put together the suggested development environment toolkit and make recommendations for network engineers looking to get started and didn't know what to get started and what tools to look at, is that as I put together a list of these are the types of tools you need. And then when I selected specific ones, my goal was to select ones that would work whether you were on Mac or Windows or Linux and work in similar ways, to make it easier for anybody to get started and take our content and use our sample code and go through our tutorials, no matter what platform you are on. Because learning new skills like how to write Python scripts or how to work with a REST API can be challenging enough. Having to fumble through multiple variations or having to figure out how to spin up a virtual machine or go through these other areas or learn Linux at the same time you're learning Python, that's more pain than necessary. And so the idea here is, to your point, today, lots of people do like Linux and Mac, but Windows continues to be probably the most popular operating system for everybody that's out there. And so what we wanted to do is to make it easy for, if your chosen platform or your dictated platform, because lots of organizations do say this is what you have to use, is Windows, and showing that doesn't have to stop you from exploring these skills. This dialogue is really good because this installation is taking way longer than I expected. My internet here at my current location is a bit slower than normal, which is probably what's driving some of these stuff.
No worries about that. I think that's a really good point you've made, because I prefer Linux. I use a Mac as my daily workstation, if you like. I think Linux is fantastic for development and other things, but it's good that, if you don't like those platforms or you don't have access to those platforms, you are not held back because you're on Windows. And I think that's really good to know. And I also think it's sad that some guys, say things that they perhaps shouldn't say, when they say you should use Linux or you should use a Mac. And you have this sort of self-righteousness, I think, sometimes, where some guys think this platform is better than that platform. And I don't think we should get into those arguments. It's all about, just help everyone get on board with this sort of process.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with kind of the debates and making and explaining why I personally use a Mac as my primary platform. But just the default knee-jerk reaction to say that that's bad without having any particular piece or not actually having a recent reason to think that way, those frustrate me as well.
Yeah, I mean, my idea was it's great that, as you said, Windows isn't the way it was. I mean, I was still very much under the perception that you should use a Mac or you should use Linux rather than Windows if you want to take this seriously. And it's nice to see these tools and these options are available now for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. And with luck, this one will actually finish its installation at some point. While we're letting that go, we can actually move ahead and talk about some of these other ones. And actually, we mentioned Chrome already. And obviously, the browser discussion is one of those ones that can be just as kind of emotionally charged as the platform discussion. And I don't want to get into this browser over another. I will say that my primary browser on my Mac is Apple Safari. And I use that because of the convenience and how well it works for my just general web browsing use cases between my Mac and my iPhone and my tablet and those. And that's honestly what drives my personal use for my primary browser. But from a development perspective and working with different kinds of web applications or building a web interface or trying to explore what's going on under the hood with APIs, really Chrome is a great browser to become comfortable with because it has some tools for it. So I've already installed it. Most folks know how to install a web browser, so I don't think we need to show how that goes through. But one of the things that's really nice about, and I'm trying to get my window here arranged the way I want it. One of the things that's nice about what Google Chrome offers is what's called the developer tools. So here underneath the menu, there's this more tools piece, and then it says developer tools. And what the developer tools do, let me see if I can get these moved where I want them. How do I shift its position? Where is it? There we go. I want it on I like it having it on the right. So what the developer tools do is actually like a peek behind the curtain at how your web browser is functioning and what's going through there. And there's a few things that I find really useful as it goes in. And so I'm going to open up a web page or an application that I built specifically to do training for folks on how I can't talk and type at the same time, at how microservice and web applications work. So we can ignore what the app is. It's just a really basic REST API-driven microservice application that lets you vote for superheroes. I use it for some training classes on how app development works. But the reason I bring it up here is that with these development tools inside of Chrome, you can look at this network tab that's here and you can actually watch the API calls that your web pages are making under the hood. And so, for example, if I go in here and I say, we're going to place a vote for Spider-Man. When I click on that, I'm going to stop. Over here in the side, what you actually see are all of the API calls that the web browser is making to the other side. And so getting into web development or looking at web page stuff may not be the first thing that a network engineer does. But if you think about it, every web GUI for every management tool that you have these days, the way that they work is actually, they work like web apps. Is they run in your browser. And then when you click a button, under the hood, what it's doing is making a REST API call off someplace to go do something to that network piece of equipment that's there. And so you can use the developer tools here to actually see what's going on under the hood. And so here, if I look at this request here is actually the API call that was made by this browser to place the vote for Spider-Man. And so getting access to under the hood of what's going on here is really kind of interesting to learn more about how some of these things work. So we can see the request URL was api.myheroimapex.io/vote/Spider-Man. So that's how the vote for Spider-Man was done. We can see the status code came back as 200 OK. We can see the actual IP that was there. We can explore the response that came through. And so Chrome, for me, it's highly used all over the place. But the reason I always recommend folks get comfortable with it is so that you're ready to start using some of these other things that are there. Another piece that's really nice that developer tools give you is this console view. And so likely most folks recognize that the way web applications kind of work these days is with JavaScript. And there's lots of different frameworks and libraries between React and Angular and all of these things that web developers use to make web applications interactive. This console view here actually shows you error messages and things that are happening inside of JavaScript. And so there's tons of other stuff in the developer tools, but the two that I always look at is the network tab to kind of see what's going on under the hood with the API calls, and then the console tab, which gives me the ability to actually go and kind of look and see what types of error messages might be happening as they go through. Now, let's be fair, Safari has a similar developer tools, Firefox has developer tools, and there's lots of plugins you can go in through it. And so it's not to say that you only can use Google Chrome for this type of piece, but I do find that it's a good browser to go. And so if folks are trying to figure out where to go through, that's often why I recommend folks start with Chrome on that side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I agree with you. And another reason I used Chrome was because of Postman. But it's great to hear that it's like a separate app now. I mean, if you go back to network, what's nice there I saw was the REST calls under network. You could see get, post. So that shows us sort of just below there where your mouse is now. Yeah, access control, allow methods. It's great to see those delete, get, put. Real, what you would see in a REST call. It's great to see it here.
It's really handy to be able to get that glimpse under the hood, particularly because we see more and more of the stuff we're doing is being driven through these. And so hopefully at some point Postman install will finish and we'll take a look at it where you can actually explore these more deeply. So let's go check on that. All right, so the Postman installation is finished and I've gone ahead and opened it up. And so I've been using Postman for a long time. So when I reinstalled it on my laptop here, it opened right back up. Now, the first time you install Postman, if you've never done it before, it'll actually come up and prompt you to create a Postman account. Now, the Postman account is free, and so you are welcome to do it. But down at the very bottom of the window, it's kind of hard to see the link because I think Postman wants you to create an account for every reason that every service provider out there wants you to create an account. But there's a link at the very bottom of the screen that says, skip setting up an account, just take me to the app. Now, the reason I tell folks that you might want to set up an account is because if you set up an account and then you have Postman installed on more than one workstation or more than one environment or on a server in a lab someplace, Postman, by having an account, it'll actually keep all of your settings synchronized. And so you don't have to remember to export and import in things like collections that we'll look at and some of these other pieces. And so it doesn't hurt to have an account, and they're free, and they go through, and they don't bother you with a bunch of spam. You can sign up for newsletters like everything else, but the account does have some value to it. So we're here in the interface, and as I mentioned, what we'll use this for as network engineers is to work with and explore different APIs that are available. Now we'll take a look at some of the APIs that are available for network pieces, but I always like to start out with something maybe just a little bit fun. And so, I'm trying to get my mouse to work for me here. There we go. So one of the things that I like to go through is I'm a big fan of jokes that are there. And so there's actually an API called for dad jokes. And I don't know if this has gone internationally or even over to the UK yet, but in the US, dad jokes are the types of jokes that dads like me, I've got 2 kids, like to tell their kids and make them groan that are out there. And so I found, and I thought it was really funny, that there was an API that you can use to request those types of jokes. And so let's try that out and see if our Postman client is working. And so it's HTTPS. REST APIs go off of HTTPS as they go through. And it is I can has dad joke. And that's the name of this this place. I think I can make this font a little bigger so we can see it. Yeah. So there we go. So the URL is just icanhasdadjoke.com, and it's a GET request. And if you're still familiar or becoming familiar with REST API requests, GET requests are typically when you're trying to retrieve information from someplace. The other types of methods that you'll see in here, there are lots in HTTP, but the ones that we really need to be aware of are GET to retrieve information. POST is usually used to create a new record. And so if we think about this from a network perspective, if you're trying to create a VLAN in a device, you might post to create that new VLAN. Put might be used to update a piece of information. So if you're trying to add an IP address to a switch interface, you might put that there. And then delete is fairly intuitive. It would be if you wanted to delete something. All these other ones have special purposes. Those 4 are usually enough to get folks by. And so let's see if this one is working. Now, if you just go to the web page for I can has dad joke, and we could open that in Chrome in a browser, you get a web page and it would show it. The way that we instruct that we actually are making an API call is with a feature of APIs in HTTP called headers. So when you send a web request, you send the URL, and then under the hood, your web browser is also including a bunch of other information. Sometimes that's called like metadata, data about your request. And these are often enclosed in headers. And there's a header called accept. And what the accept header does is it tells whoever you're asking for information what type of information you want back. And now normally when you're browsing the internet, the type of information you want back is just an HTML web page. And so that would be the default. But what I actually want when we make an API call is JSON data. JSON data says, don't send me a bunch of HTML, send me a JSON payload that I can go ahead and use in some sort of a piece that's there. And so we put our URL in, we're making a GET request, we put our header in, what we're after, and then we go ahead and send this off. And now we see we get this body down here, and make sure yep. And so down here we've got our body. This is a JSON body of data, and the joke that I got back was slept like a log last night, woke up in the fireplace. And so that gives you the idea of what dad jokes are here in the US. They're just these little tacky, groany jokes. We'll actually go grab another one. Dad says, I'm cold. Go stand in the corner. I hear it's 90 degrees. Or someone says, Dad, I'm cold. And he says, well, go stand in the corner. It's 90 degrees. So we've made an API call with it that's here. So you can use Postman, as we mentioned as we were talking about it, for any kind of API that's there. There are tons of them. There are ones for jokes. There's ones for different facts or quotes. You can get weather information. Or what's interesting for us is you can use it for network information. And so now we'll make a couple of network API requests that are there. And now to do that, we're going to talk a bit about a couple of the features that Postman has that makes this useful to use. And so over here in the corner, there's this show sidebar button. And so what the sidebar button does is this is where we go ahead. Actually, I'm going to make this full screen so we can see it. What the sidebar button does is opens up this area where we've got what Postman calls collections. And collections are those bookmarks of saved requests. And so I've got a whole bunch of them that are here, and I'm going to scroll down to a whole folder here called Network Programmability Basics. These are actually the REST API requests that are part of the Network Programmability Basics video course that we've talked about before on some of our videos, David. And so in here, we can see I've got folders for a whole bunch of different types of network devices that are out there that we can make requests for. And so we'll start out with, you got one in here that looks interesting? They all should work. So is there one that gets you more interesting than others, David?
Anyone, doesn't matter. Really, Hank, whichever one you think's good. Nexus API REST is nice. RestComp is good.
Yep. All right. We'll go with RestComp because I clicked on it. And so as a reminder, what RestComp is RestComp's the REST API version of NetConf. And you use these to interact with data models, Yang data models. And so in here, I've got a handful of different RestConf requests that we could target. And so we'll grab this one here, which is to read IETF interface list of interface names. And so IETF interfaces is a Yang data model. And so in here, what the collection has is it saves all of the settings for this API. So it's a GET request, it's HTTPS. We can see in here these double curly braces are actually variables. We'll talk about those in just a second. So it says go to the host and then the port. And so that's how we get to the device. And then it's RestConf data, IETF interfaces. The collection also saves any headers that are needed. And so we can see the content type header, the accept header. We talked about accept. That's when you're asking for the server to send you back information of a particular type. Content type is if you're sending information, letting the server know what type of info you're sending. And then this authorization header is used to pass credentials back and forth. And so the way that we get this type of information, and actually the authorization header is built based on this authorization tab. So we can see it says basic auth and it needs a variable for username. And if I show the password, you can see it's a variable for password. One of the other really handy features for Postman is this concept called environments. And what environments are, gives you the ability to save variables that can be used inside of these types of requests. And so I'm going to select the the environment for one of our sandboxes. And so this is our DevNet sandbox, RestComp always on. This is a sandbox that's available on the internet, and it's there specifically for testing and working with different types of APIs like this one in RestComp. And so we can see it's got some variables here. The host variable has iosxemanagement.cisco.com. RestConf in this case happens to run on port 9443, and then the username and password for this device. And this is an iOS XE. It's a CSR 1000V running up just in our data center and available on the internet. And so the way that these go through is this here where it says host will just be replaced with this one, port will be replaced with this, where the username and password are there. What's nice about using the environments is this API call will work with any RestConf device, and I can flip between different types of environments. And so you might have an environment for the DevNet sandbox, and you might have one for one that you got in your lab, and then you might have one for a production device. And you don't have to change the API call. You just flip between these different environments that are there. So with that done, let's go ahead and make this request and see if this will give us some information about the interfaces on this device. And I got down here status 200 OK. 200 OKs are typically good when you're requesting information. And if I scroll down, we'll see that indeed I get information back about the interfaces. And so Gigabit Ethernet 1, I can see here we've got something. Gigabit Ethernet 2, and there's probably some loopbacks and other pieces that are here because this sandbox is used for some of our learning labs around RestConf and different pieces. So quick example on how we can use Postman for it. Questions? Make sense?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you, just for everyone's benefit, is what is JSON?
Oh, that's a really good question. So JSON is a data format. And so I actually have a really good way we can dive into that. So JSON's a data format. Right here, this syntax is JSON format, and it stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And as the name might imply, it was originally designed for use with JavaScript, but it can be used with any programming language. It's really quite heavily used with Python, and so you'll use that a lot if you go through. And what data formats are ways to package up information for transport between different types of systems. And so JSON's a data format, XML is another data format. And so what you have with data formats is you can get the same information. So in this case, we've got information about network interfaces, and we can get it in JSON. Or I'm going to go, because I talk about this in one of my classes on Python data formats. I'm going to open up one of my GitHub repos just to use as an example for some examples here. Python networking. And then data manipulation. All right. So I'm going to switch into this JSON folder, and then I've got a file here called jsonexample.json. And so what this is this is a JSON formatted description of an interface, right? So it's interface. We've got a key called interface. The value of that key is details about an entire interface. The interface has a name, it has a description, it has an enabled status. And so I can represent Gigabit Ethernet 2 in JSON format. Now, if I go back from JSON, I can go look in the XML directory, and I've got xmlexample.xml. And so now what we see is the exact same network interface, but now described using XML data format. And so XML is like HTML. It's a markup format. It's very tag based. And so we can see we open up with this first interface tag. It's closed down at the bottom down here. And then inside there, we have all of the information about this interface. There's a name tag that opens and then closes. And then between that is the value Gigabit Ethernet 2. Same thing with description and enabled. So JSON is a data format that can be used to represent data. XML is another data format. And when you're working with REST APIs, oftentimes you can choose whether you want JSON or XML data. And so if I go back to, do I still have it open? Yep. If I go back to Postman here, in my headers, I requested in the accept header yang-data to indicate it was a yang data model data plus JSON. If I change this from plus JSON to plus XML and resend it, this will send the same API request. It will return the same information, but now the information came back in XML format. And so that's one of the pieces when working with programmability and APIs is sometimes you have choices about what type of data format you're after. Now, oftentimes, I don't think I'm alone in this one. I typically prefer JSON if I have the choice, which is why my APIs always default to that. But XML is another data format, and there's other ones. YAML is another common format that can be used. And just to kind of complete the circle, we can actually look at this same Gigabit Ethernet 2 we were seeing from the example, formatted in YAML. And I will include the link to these different files in the show notes since we went off on this topic. We can have people look at it. So I've got YAML example.yaml. If I look at YAML and I scroll back down to it, now we can see Gigabit Ethernet 2, same exact information, or same exact interface, same exact information, but now it's in YAML format. What's interesting about YAML is where JSON and XML are heavily used what are called syntax indicators. And so in JSON, it was all the curly braces, the quote symbols, the colons, the commas. In XML, the syntax is all about those tags that look like HTML tags. YAML was written to kind of limit the number of syntax things to make it an easy to read for human data format, as easy as it is for programming languages like Python to consume it. And so for when I really have all of my choices, I often like to use YAML as my data format because this is really easy to work with. It's all based on white space. So the hard part of YAML is being consistent in your spacing. And so we'll see each of these, the name, description, enabled, all have 2 spaces before them. After this colon, there has to be a space. That's not that hard to deal with, and I prefer that to having to trace down missing tags or curly braces or square brackets and some of that other stuff. Does that help on the JSON question?
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's nice to see those 3 side by side.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually one of the things that whenever I talk about getting started with programmability and these pieces, I always start with data formats because you'll run across in your work with JSON, XML, and YAML in different projects. And so being really comfortable with consuming them and then knowing how to work with them in your code is a critical skill to have.
And I just want to say your course on DevNet, your video-based course, goes through this and a whole bunch of other stuff, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, it does. Yeah. And to continue the shameless plugs that we've done in other ones, if we go and look at, nope, not that one, cisco.com/video/netprog. Basics, if I remember the URL correctly. Nope, I did not. I'll just go find it here on DevNet on the main page. We've got this link here for video course. One of the first modules we have actually goes through the data formats. And so here let's let it load up. Here in the programming fundamentals, we can see the first lesson is all about understanding and using JSON, XML, and YAML. It's so important. It's the first technical lesson in the entire video course.
And you're allowed to plug it, Hank, because it's free. So I just want, if guys who are joining this say and haven't watched the other videos, all the resources on DevNet are free.
Absolutely.